What did you think of Jim's comments on the Second Vatican Council? He says it's a valid council, but it contains some error, namely dignitatis humanae, and so there's a question of its level of authority, and the magisterium should be clear on, whether or not there needs to be adherence, stuff like that. So, what was your impression of that portion?
Well, I think he was kind because the society in its own writings deals with Vatican II much more harshly than Jim presented it. I mean, let's
Mhm.
face it, the society priests claim that Vatican II taught heresy.
Yeah.
That's what they say. The collegiality is one example where they say that's an heretical doctrine, etc. And I got the impression that Jim and the society, is putting the burden on the church to clarify her teaching, but really, and also the level of assent. Okay, that's the burden on the church to tell us that. Well, I would say no. The problem is with the society, not with the church, because the society actually, we talked about the presumption of malice. They actually assume out of the gate that the interpretation is in error, it's erroneous, or it's heretical. They assume the worst and then
Mhm.
place the burden on the church to have to come back and clarify it. But that's not how the church has dealt with conciliar texts. I mean, Auctorum Fide, right, laid out the principle that if there is a teaching that could be interpreted in a heretical manner, we are required to reject outright the heretical interpretation and rather interpret the teaching in light of tradition. The society has the opposite approach. There seems to be, Michael, and maybe you agree with this or disagree, I don't know, but there seems to be a presumption of error, and the burden's back on the church to clarify this. That's not how things work.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're supposed to presume that there's reconcilability with any kind of apparent contradictions, just like we would with sacred scripture. Now, obviously, in the case of scripture, you also have the question of inspiration that's going to certainly guarantee a harmonization. But in the same way that you would harmonize seemingly contradictory things in sacred scripture, the same principle applies to the magisterium. So really, the burden of proof is on somebody to demonstrate continuity rather than, I'm sorry, demonstrate discontinuity if they're going to make that claim,
Yeah,
rather
yeah.
than just presume it. And insofar as I've been able to tell, I don't see any definitive points of discontinuity between dignitatis humanae and the 19th century popes, or even questions of collegiality. That was another thing that was brought up. I
Yeah. Well, my and this goes back 15 years, 20 years of study for me. My biggest difficulty has been with Dignitatis Humanae, because I've read all of the encyclicals on religious liberty dating back to the 17th, 18th century. And the way I've come to understand or reconcile the teaching in Dignitatis Humanae, the most problematic being that man has a right not to be hindered publicly in his religious teaching and practice. That statement does seem problematic,
Mhm.
but I think it could be reconciled if you say you're talking about a person in a non-Catholic state, and you're talking about the civil law. Well, that
Mhm.
is true. Then a person from a civil law standpoint who lives in a non-Catholic state would civilly have the right not to be hindered in his public teaching and practice. Doesn't mean that the church is saying what he believes is true. Okay, so there are some things that I think can be reconciled with some difficulty. But you mentioned collegiality.
Yeah.
Collegiality, and Jim, quoting him from the interview, said that is a point of departure, from tradition, but he never explained what he meant. It's not at all. I can say this too. I've had private correspondence, and Robert Sisko has had private correspondence with society priests on this matter of collegiality. We haven't really published it, but we're at a point where they can't answer our rebuttals. They do not understand collegiality and what Vatican II is teaching. They make two errors without getting way off target, Mike. I just want to mention these two things because Jim brought it up. It is not a point of departure. It is actually completely consonant with what the fathers held in their schemas at Vatican I, with all the post-Vatican I, pre-Vatican II theology manuals, that Christ established a primacy, which was emphasized at Vatican I, and an episcopate, which was
Yeah.
emphasized at Vatican II, the Pope being the head. Okay.
Yeah.
And we know that Christ gave Peter the keys alone in Matthew 16, but he also gave the apostolic authority up to the apostles to share in the power of the keys by binding and loosing when they are in hierarchical communion with the Holy Father. And so there is a distinction between the primacy, which Peter alone holds, and the episcopate and the power of supreme jurisdiction that all the bishops collectively exercise when in union with Peter. And the society has erred, and we'll say this definitively, and we can prove this from their own writings. They have conflated the primacy with supreme authority. The society in all their writings say that the bishops do not share in the supreme authority because they think supreme authority deals with Peter's power of primacy. They're two completely different things. The bishops of the Roman Catholic Church, when united to Peter, share in the supreme authority. They are a second subject of supreme authority. This is how they act as definitive judges in an ecumenical council. They don't hold it individually like Peter does, but they share in it because Christ told them as an apostolic college, whatever you in the plural bind or loose on earth is bound or loosed in heaven. So they share in the supreme authority that Peter alone holds. That's the first point. And the other point, again, without getting off on a tangent, is the society has conflated the notion of office with jurisdiction. They falsely claim that Lumen Gentium teaches that a bishop receives jurisdiction upon his episcopal consecration. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. They don't even quote it when they say that. When a bishop receives episcopal consecration, the munera, which is also called office, is merely the interior ontological functions that he receives that make him capable of doing acts of teaching and sanctifying and governing, but he can only do those licitly when he gets a canonical mission. So again, they interpret office with jurisdiction. They can play primacy with supreme jurisdiction. It irritates me, Mike, because we've spent so many years studying these things, and they're accusing the church of heresy when just the opposite is true. It's heretical to claim that the church is teaching heresy when she's actually teaching what has been held.
And what would you say to those who push back and say, but look, the Eastern churches, had a canonical mission without the Pope explicitly saying, hey, you have a canonical mission. So doesn't that maybe justify what they're saying?
All mission, if it's canonical, it's at least tacitly approved by the Holy Father.
Yep.
It's at least tacitly approved. It's never contrary to the will of the Holy Father. As I've said before, just as Christ selected and chose and sent his apostles only, right? Only Christ did that. So only the vicar of Christ chooses and sends the successors of the apostles. And so, yes, that's happened throughout history. We've studied this all the way back to Saint Eusebius and how that all carried out during the Arian crisis. Mission was carried out either with the express or at least the tacit approval of the Roman Pontiff, and never contrary to his will.
Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button. God bless.